Hey everyone, welcome to Historical Transformations. I'm Rowan, and with me, as always, is my brilliant co host, Alex.
Hi, everyone. I'm excited about today's topic. It's a story that really shows how dramatically politics can change over time.
Alex, I was thinking about how to introduce this story, and I kept coming back to this fascinating image. Imagine walking into a political party meeting in the 1980s, and then fast forward to today. You'd hardly recognize it's the same movement.
What do you mean?
Well, we're talking about social democratic parties. These were movements born in factory floors and union halls that now, well, they seem more comfortable in corporate boardrooms.
Wow, that's quite a transformation. I'm guessing that shift had some pretty big consequences.
Absolutely. Today, we're diving into how these parties changed from being champions of workers' rights to becoming advocates of market liberalization. It's a shift that has completely reshaped modern politics and society.
And the timing feels really relevant, doesn't it? With all the debates about inequality and corporate power happening right now.
Exactly. We'll explore how this massive change happened, what it meant for working people, and maybe most importantly, whether social democracy can find its way back to its roots.
I can't wait to dig into this. Where do we start?
Let me take you back to the 1990s when this transformation really kicked into high gear. You had Tony Blair in Britain, Bill Clinton in America, and Gerhard Schröder in Germany all pushing their parties in a completely new direction.
The famous third way approach, right?
Exactly. These leaders basically said, look, we can embrace markets and social justice. It was a huge departure from traditional social democratic thinking that saw capitalism as something to be tamed, not embraced.
But wasn't that a pretty controversial move within their own parties?
Oh, absolutely. Take Tony Blair's New Labor, for instance. He actually managed to get the party to drop its famous Clause 4, which had committed labor to nationalizing industry for decades. That was like changing the party's DNA.
Wow, that must have caused some serious pushback from traditional party members.
The numbers tell the story. Since the 1980s, these parties have lost between 50 and 70% of their members. Just think about that. More than half their grassroots supporters walking away.
That's a massive drop. But I'm curious, what exactly were these new policies they were pushing?
Well, they went all in on financial deregulation, privatizing public services, and basically accepting a lot of what we'd call neoliberal economic ideas. Schroeder in Germany, for instance, introduced major welfare reforms that would have been unthinkable for a social democrat just a decade earlier.
It's fascinating how they justified this, though. I mean, how did they square this with their traditional values?
The argument was essentially that the world had changed. Globalization, new technology, the collapse of the Soviet Union. They said the old methods just wouldn't work anymore. Blair famously called it modernization, bringing social democracy into the modern age.
But from what you're saying, it sounds like they might have thrown out some pretty important principles along the way.
That's the big question that's still debated today. Did they adapt to new realities, or did they just give up? Clinton's welfare reform in 1996 is a perfect example. It was meant to modernize the system, but many argue it just made life harder for the poorest Americans.
I can see why party members felt betrayed. These parties were literally founded to protect workers from market forces, and suddenly they're embracing those same market forces.
And here's what's really interesting. This shift changed not just policies, but the very nature of these parties. They started attracting a different kind of supporter and leader. More urban professionals, fewer union members. The composition of the party itself transformed.
That reminds me, didn't party funding sources change dramatically too?
Absolutely right. Instead of relying mainly on union dues and small donations, they started getting more corporate funding. It's like they were becoming exactly what they originally formed to fight against.
You know what strikes me? This whole story seems to mirror bigger changes in society. The decline of industrial jobs, the rise of the knowledge economy, globalization.
That's such a good point. These parties were trying to navigate massive social changes. But the question remains, did they need to go quite so far in embracing market solutions? Could they have found a different way to modernize?
And I guess we're still living with the consequences of those choices today.
We really are. When you look at rising inequality, the weakening of labor protections, the dominance of financial markets, a lot of that can be traced back to this period when even the left started speaking the language of the market.
It's almost like they lost their distinctive voice in the process.
And that might be the biggest transformation of all, when parties that once promised to fundamentally change the system and ended up just trying to manage it a bit more humanely.
You know, Rowan, we've talked about how these parties changed, but I'm really curious about the actual impact this had on ordinary people.
Well, let's look at some concrete numbers that really tell the story. Since 1980, worker wages have barely kept up with inflation, while corporate profits have grown by more than 300% in many countries.
300%? That's a pretty stark difference.
And here's what makes it even more interesting. A lot of this happened under social democratic governments that traditionally would have fought against this kind of inequality.
I'm guessing union membership took a hit during all this too.
Oh, absolutely. Across developed countries, we've seen union membership fall by about 30%. Think about that. These parties that were born from the union movement presided over its steepest decline.
But didn't they try to balance this out with other policies? I mean, they still called themselves progressive parties.
They did try. Take Britain's New Labour. They introduced things like the minimum wage and tax credits for working families. But here's the thing, while they were giving with one hand, they were taking away with the other through privatization and deregulation.
Can you give us a specific example of how that played out?
Let's look at what happened when they privatized public utilities. Energy prices in Britain rose by more than 40% in real terms after privatization. The companies made huge profits, but ordinary people ended up paying more for basic services.
That must have hit lower income families particularly hard.
Exactly. And it's not just utilities. Public housing, transportation, even parts of healthcare. When these services were privatized, they became more expensive and often less reliable.
I've heard some people argue that this was necessary, though, that these services were inefficient when they were public.
That was definitely the argument at the time. But look at what actually happened. Take the British Railways. After privatization, ticket prices increased way above inflation, while service quality often declined. The government actually ended up spending more on subsidies than when it ran the system directly.
So we're paying more for worse service? That seems like the opposite of what was promised.
And here's where it gets really interesting. These changes created what some economists call a two-tier society. The top 20% of earners saw their wealth grow significantly, while everyone else basically stayed still or fell behind.
That reminds me of something I read. Didn't social democratic parties start losing their traditional voters around this time?
Absolutely right. Working class voters, who had been the backbone of these parties for generations, started drifting away. By 2010, in many countries, social democratic parties were getting more support from urban professionals than from their traditional working class base.
It's like they sacrificed their core supporters in an attempt to appeal to everyone.
And the results were pretty dramatic. In Germany, Schröder's reforms led to the creation of a huge low-wage sector. Something like 20% of German workers now earn less than two-thirds of the median wage.
That's a lot of people struggling to make ends meet.
And perhaps most troubling, these changes seem to be permanent. Even when social democratic parties try to return to their roots now, they find that many of the tools they once used, strong unions, public ownership, capital controls, they're just not available anymore.
Because they helped dismantle them?
Exactly. It's like they locked themselves out of their own house. And the consequences? Well, we're living them right now. Stagnant wages, rising inequality, increasingly precarious work.
You know what strikes me as particularly ironic? These parties adopted market-friendly policies, partly to stay relevant, but it seems like that's exactly what made them less relevant to many people.
That's such a perceptive point. They won the battle for electoral success in the short term, but they might have lost the war for their soul in the process. You know, there's another fascinating layer to this story that we haven't explored yet. Tony Blair's transformation of the Labour Party wasn't just about changing policies, it was a complete reinvention of what it meant to be on the left.
I've always wondered how he managed to convince his party to go along with such dramatic changes.
Well, Blair was incredibly skilled at framing these changes as inevitable. In 1994, he told his party conference, and I'll never forget this line, "The world has changed and we must change with it."
But how did that actually play out in practice?
The transformation was incredibly systematic. Blair's team actually studied focus groups and polling data obsessively. They wanted to know exactly what middle-class voters wanted, and they rebuilt the party's image around those desires.
That sounds more like marketing than politics.
That's exactly what many critics said. The party started using corporate communication strategies. They even brought in private sector consultants to reshape their message.
But what happened to all the traditional Labour Party members during this time?
The numbers are pretty striking. Under Blair, Labour's individual membership initially surged to around 400,000, but by 2007, it had fallen to less than 200,000. Many longtime members felt the party no longer represented their values.
And what about union support? Wasn't that always Labour's backbone?
That's where things get really interesting. Blair actually reduced union voting power at party conferences from 90% in the 1980s to just 50%. He also started actively courting business leaders and wealthy donors.
Wait, so where did the party's funding come from then?
By 2005, corporate donations made up a significant portion of Labour's funding. There was even a scandal about loans from wealthy business people who were later nominated for peerages.
That seems like a pretty fundamental shift in who the party was actually accountable to.
Absolutely, and it showed in their policies. Take the Financial Services and Markets Act of 2000. It created what Blair called light touch regulation of the banking sector. something that would have been unthinkable for previous labor governments.
But didn't they balance that with more progressive policies elsewhere?
They did introduce some important reforms: the minimum wage, civil partnerships, the Human Rights Act. But when it came to economic policy, they largely continued Margaret Thatcher's market friendly approach.
I'm curious about the internal debates. Surely some party members pushed back against this.
Oh, yes, there were some fierce arguments. John Prescott, Blair's deputy, often acted as a bridge to the traditional left, but Blair's team was remarkably effective at marginalizing opposition. They even had a nickname for critics. They called them dinosaurs.
That's pretty harsh, labeling anyone who disagreed as outdated.
And here's what's fascinating about Blair's approach. He didn't just change policies, he changed the entire language of left-wing politics. Terms like class struggle and socialism were out. The new buzzwords were stakeholder society and social inclusion.
It almost sounds like they were trying to make socialism not sound like socialism anymore.
Exactly. Blair famously declared that the class war was over, but critics argued he hadn't ended the class war, he'd just switched sides.
Did any other European social democratic parties follow this model?
Gerhard Schröder in Germany was probably the closest parallel. He even co-wrote a paper with Blair called The Third Way, which became almost like a manifesto for this new approach.
And I'm guessing the traditional left wasn't too happy about that either.
They certainly weren't. Oscar Lafontaine, Schröder's finance minister, actually resigned in protest, saying the government had betrayed its social democratic principles.
You know, looking back, it feels like this was more than just a political shift. It was almost like a cultural revolution within these parties.
That's such a good way to put it. Blair didn't just change what labor did, he changed what labor was. And those changes are still shaping left-wing politics today. You know what's fascinating about this whole story? All these changes we've been discussing, they didn't just reshape social democratic parties. They created this huge political vacuum that new movements rushed to fill.
Right. Nature abhors a vacuum, as they say. What happened?
Well, by 2015, we started seeing these dramatic shifts. In Greece, Syriza basically replaced the traditional Social Democratic Party PASOK. In Spain, Podemos emerged from seemingly nowhere to challenge the established Socialist Party.
And these weren't just minor protest movements, were they?
Not at all. Syriza actually won the Greek election. Just think about that. A party that didn't even exist a few years earlier managed to completely overtake a social democratic party that had been around for decades.
That's incredible, but wasn't there also something happening on the right?
This is where it gets really interesting. Traditional working-class communities, feeling abandoned by social democratic parties, started turning to right-wing populist movements in huge numbers.
Do we have any specific examples of that shift?
Look at what happened in Northern England. Towns that had voted Labour for generations suddenly switched to supporting Brexit and then the Conservatives. The numbers are striking. In some traditional Labour seats, we saw swings of more than 20 percentage points.
That's a pretty dramatic shift. But why specifically to the right?
These right-wing movements were really clever. They basically said, hey, these social democratic parties used to represent you, but now they're more interested in urban professionals and big business. We'll stand up for your traditional values and communities.
And people believe them?
Well, here's the thing. When you look at voting patterns, it's clear that many people weren't necessarily embracing right-wing economics. They were expressing frustration with parties that they felt had abandoned them.
I've heard some analysts call this a kind of political realignment.
Exactly. The traditional left-right divide started breaking down. Instead, we began seeing this split between what some call the winners and losers of globalization. Social democratic parties increasingly represented the winners.
And I'm guessing that left a lot of people feeling politically homeless.
The electoral data is pretty striking. In France, the Socialist Party went from getting around 25% of the vote to just 6% in 2017. Similar collapses happened across Europe.
But weren't there also new left-wing movements trying to fill this gap?
Yes. Look at the rise of figures like Bernie Sanders in America or Jeremy Corbyn in Britain. They tried to revive traditional social democratic policies, but they faced this interesting challenge. The political infrastructure that once supported these ideas had largely been dismantled.
What do you mean by political infrastructure?
Strong unions, community organizations, local party structures, these were all weakened during the Third Way period. So when these new movements tried to rebuild them, they were starting almost from scratch.
That must have made it really hard to organize effectively.
And here's what makes this story so relevant today. We're still seeing the consequences play out. Traditional social democratic parties are caught in this really difficult position. They can't easily go back to their old approach, but their new model isn't really working either.
Sounds like they're stuck between a rock and a hard place.
That's exactly it. And meanwhile, populist movements on both left and right are continuing to gain ground. In Italy, in Sweden, in France, we're seeing these massive shifts in voting patterns that would have been unthinkable 20 years ago.
It's almost like the more these traditional parties tried to appeal to everyone, the more they ended up appealing to no one.
And that might be the biggest lesson from this whole story. When political parties abandon their core principles and constituencies, the results can be far more dramatic than they ever imagined. Alex, with all these challenges we've discussed, I think the big question now is where does social democracy go from here? The landscape in 2025 looks so different from even a few years ago.
Right? And they're facing some totally new challenges too. Artificial intelligence, climate change, the changing nature of work.
Exactly. And what's fascinating is we're seeing this real split in how different parties are trying to handle these challenges. Some are attempting to return to their roots, while others are looking for completely new approaches.
Can you give us some concrete examples of what's happening?
Well, take the Danish Social Democrats. They've actually managed to win back working class voters by combining strong welfare policies with stricter immigration controls. It's controversial, but they argue it's necessary to protect their social model.
That's an interesting mix of left and right policies. Are other parties trying similar approaches?
The Portuguese Socialist Party has taken a different path. They've formed alliances with parties to their left while still maintaining moderate economic policies. And surprisingly, it's been working. They've managed to reduce inequality while keeping markets stable.
But what about all these new challenges? I mean, how do you apply traditional social democratic ideas to something like artificial intelligence?
That's where it gets really interesting. Some parties are proposing what they call digital socialism, using technology to enhance public services rather than just maximize profits. They're talking about things like publicly owned digital platform.
That sounds pretty ambitious. But are voters actually buying into these new ideas?
The polling data is fascinating. Around 60% of young voters say they're open to new forms of social ownership and economic democracy. But, and here's the catch, they don't necessarily trust traditional parties to deliver it.
So they like the ideas but not the messengers?
Exactly. And that's pushing parties to experiment with new forms of organization. Some are trying to become more like social movements with direct democracy and local decision making.
But can these old parties really reinvent themselves that dramatically?
Well, look at what's happening in Finland. Their social democrats have managed to build this interesting coalition between urban progressives and traditional working class voters. They're focusing on universal basic services, green technology, and reducing working hours.
That sounds more like social democracy 2.0.
And here's what makes this moment so crucial. These parties are realizing they can't just tinker around the edges anymore. Climate change, inequality, technological disruption, these challenges require fundamental reforms.
But do they have the political power to make those kinds of changes?
That's the million-dollar question. Some are trying to build new alliances with environmental movements, with tech workers, with precarious workers in the gig economy. The idea is to create this broad coalition for progressive change.
It almost sounds like they're trying to recreate the kind of mass movement they had in the 20th century, but for totally different conditions.
That's such a good observation. And they're having to grapple with questions their predecessors never faced. Like, how do you ensure democratic control over artificial intelligence? How do you protect workers' rights in a digital economy?
And I'm guessing climate change adds another whole layer of complexity.
Absolutely. Many social democratic parties are now talking about a Green New Deal, combining environmental protection with social justice. But they're having to convince traditional industrial workers that this transition can benefit them too.
That sounds like a pretty delicate balancing act.
It really is. And you know what might be the biggest challenge? They're trying to do all this while competing with populist movements that offer much simpler solutions.
So what do you think? Can social democracy reinvent itself for these new times?
The next few years will be crucial. These parties are realizing they need to be both radical and practical, visionary about the future, but grounded in people's real needs. Whether they can pull that off, well, that might determine not just their future, but the future of democratic politics itself. Alex, when we look at this transformation of social democratic parties, it's really a story about how difficult it is to balance ideals with political reality.
And it's fascinating how these changes had such huge ripple effects, but not just on politics, but on society as a whole.
Exactly. What started as an attempt to modernize left-wing politics ended up fundamentally reshaping the relationship between workers, governments, and markets. The consequences are still playing out today.
I keep thinking about those statistics you mentioned, the massive drop in party membership, the rising inequality. It really shows how political choices have real-world impacts.
And here's what I find most compelling. These parties are now facing challenges their founders could never have imagined. Artificial intelligence, climate change, the gig economy.
So I guess the big question is, can they find a way to stay true to their original mission while tackling these new challenges?
That's exactly it. And you know what makes this story so relevant? It's not just about political parties. It's about how we as a society balance markets and democracy, efficiency, and fairness.
Sounds like the same questions they were wrestling with 100 years ago, just in a completely new context.
And that might be the most important lesson here. The tools and tactics might change, but the fundamental challenge remains. How do we build a society that's both prosperous and fair? Social democracy's transformation shows just how difficult and important that question really is.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to share it with your friends. See you next time.